Sometimes the smallest sound in the night can stop an army in its tracks. The wind moved slowly across the prisoner camp like a long breath passing over cold ground. It was late autumn in 1944, somewhere in the wide flat farmland of the American Midwest, where miles of open fields stretched beyond the barbed wire fences, and the sky felt so large it almost swallowed the watchtowers whole. The camp slept under a pale moon. Wooden barracks stood in straight rows like quiet cattle barns, their roofs silvered by frost, their windows dark except for the faint yellow glow of a lantern here and there. Gravel paths ran between the buildings, crunching softly under the boots of the night patrol. Outside Barrack 7, a group of American soldiers walked their usual route, rifles resting easily in their hands, breath visible in the cold air as thin clouds drifting toward the stars. Corporal Daniel Mercer led the patrol that night. He was 26 years old, from a small wheat town outside Wichita, Kansas, where winter winds sounded almost exactly like the ones that moved across the camp now. Daniel had been stationed at the camp for 6 months, long enough for the routines of the place to become almost mechanical. Every night the same path. Every night the same watch rotations. Every night the same silence from the barracks once lights out passed. Inside those wooden buildings were German prisoners of war, mostly communications workers, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries captured across Europe and North Africa. They were quiet prisoners for the most part. They followed rules. They worked in the nearby fields during the day under supervision. They returned to their bunks at dusk. By 9 o'clock the camp usually fell into the kind of stillness that only existed far from cities, where the loudest sound might be a distant freight train rolling through the plains 30 miles away. Daniel's patrol had almost reached the end of the gravel path when something unusual touched the air. At first it was so soft none of them noticed. Just a thin thread of sound carried along the wind, so delicate it almost blended with the creak of the wooden buildings and the faint rattle of loose fence wire. But then it came again. A voice. Singing. Daniel stopped walking. The gravel crunched under his boot one last time before silence swallowed the sound. Behind him the other soldiers took 2 more steps before realizing he had stopped. One of them, Private Leonard Hayes from Ohio, tilted his head slightly, listening. The voice drifted again from the direction of Barrack 7. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a crowd singing together like soldiers marching or workers passing time. It was a single voice. A woman's voice, soft and steady, rising and falling with a melody none of the Americans recognized, but somehow understood all the same. The patrol stood motionless on the gravel path. No one spoke. The camp had rules about noise after lights out. Barracks were supposed to remain quiet so guards could maintain order and count prisoners easily if needed. But the sound moving through the cold air wasn't defiant. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't even meant for the guards outside the building. It sounded like something meant for someone very close by. Daniel slowly raised one hand behind him without turning around. The signal meant stop. The soldiers froze completely now, boots planted, breath hanging in the air. The singing continued from inside Barrack 7. The melody carried a calm rhythm, gentle and unhurried, the kind of song someone might use to steady a restless child or quiet a frightened mind. Daniel felt something strange happen inside the patrol line. The men who had been walking with easy discipline a moment earlier were now standing perfectly still, their attention drawn toward that single voice as if the night itself had asked them to listen. Private Hayes leaned slightly toward Daniel and whispered, "You hear that?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He stepped off the gravel path and moved a few yards closer to the barrack wall, boots careful now on the frozen dirt. The wooden boards of the building were rough and weathered, their surfaces worn by months of wind and summer heat. The singing floated through the narrow cracks between the planks like light slipping through shutters. The voice wasn't strong in the way trained singers were strong. It was quiet strength, steady breath, careful phrasing. Whoever was singing inside that building wasn't performing. She was comforting someone. Daniel placed one gloved hand lightly against the wood of the barrack wall and listened. Inside the building, the song continued in a language the Americans didn't understand. German, most likely, but the emotion carried through the words easily enough. It sounded patient, reassuring, like someone telling another human being that the night would pass. Behind Daniel, the patrol waited in silence. One of the soldiers shifted his weight slightly, gravel ticking under his heel, then stopped again as the singing carried across the yard. The strange thing was that none of the men seemed eager to interrupt it. Military instinct said investigate. Regulations said enforce quiet hours. But the moment felt different somehow, as if the camp itself had paused along with them. Daniel tilted his head closer to the wall and heard another sound beneath the singing. A faint movement inside, the creak of a bunk frame, a quiet voice answering weakly before fading again. The singer continued without hesitation, her voice smooth and calm like someone guiding a slow river through the dark. The cold air brushed across the yard again, carrying the melody farther now. Even the guard in the distant watchtower turned his head slightly in the direction of the barrack, though he remained at his post under the lantern glow. Daniel took a slow breath. The air tasted like dry winter wheat fields and distant wood smoke from farmhouses miles away. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening to a song that had traveled halfway around the world only to land inside a wooden building surrounded by American barbed wire. Finally, Private Hayes stepped closer behind him and whispered again, "Corporal, what do we do?" Daniel looked down the gravel path where the lantern light stretched across the ground like a pale ribbon. The camp remained silent except for that voice drifting through the barrack boards. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Daniel lowered his hand from the wood and quietly said, "Nothing." The singing continued, and for the first time since the patrol had begun its rounds that night, the soldiers outside Barrack 7 were no longer walking. They were standing still, listening to a song that had stopped them cold. The song continued for a few more moments after Corporal Daniel Mercer gave the quiet order to do nothing, and in those moments the entire rhythm of the camp seemed to slow down. The wind brushed along the wooden walls of Barrack 7 and carried the melody across the yard like a thread of warm air drifting through winter cold. None of the soldiers spoke. Even Private Leonard Hayes, who usually had something to say about every unusual situation, kept his voice sealed behind his teeth. Daniel stood with his hands resting lightly at his sides, his eyes fixed on the rough boards of the barrack wall, as if the sound itself had weight. The voice inside moved gently through the melody, rising and falling in a calm pattern that did not hurry and did not falter. It sounded patient, careful, almost protective. Daniel had heard singing before during his months stationed at the camp. Sometimes the prisoners would hum quietly during work assignments in the fields, especially when the sun was low and the tractors were finishing their final passes across the wheat stubble. Those songs were short and practical, the kind that workers used to measure time. But this was different. This voice carried something slower, something meant for a single listener. Private Hayes shifted his weight and leaned slightly closer to Daniel. His whisper barely moved the air. "Corporal, that sounds like it is coming from the bunks." Daniel nodded once without turning his head. The lantern light from the nearby watchtower stretched across the ground and painted long shadows between the barracks. From inside the building the voice continued, softer now, as if the singer had lowered her tone so the sound would remain inside the room rather than escape through the walls. Daniel moved a few inches closer to the wooden planks and listened carefully. Beneath the singing, he could hear small movements. Fabric brushing against wood. A faint cough. Then the singer's voice returning again with that same steady rhythm. Whoever she was singing to someone who needed the calm more than sleep. The patrol behind Daniel remained perfectly still. One of the younger soldiers, Private Thomas Bell from Missouri, quietly lowered the strap of his rifle from his shoulder so it would not squeak against the metal buckle. No one wanted to break the moment. The camp was supposed to operate on rules and schedules, but in that yard under the moonlight the rules had paused for a reason none of the men could fully explain. Daniel stepped away from the wall just enough to see the narrow window near the corner of the barrack. A thin line of warm lantern light glowed through the glass, blurred by frost that had begun forming along the edges. He imagined the interior easily. 2 long rows of metal bunk beds, thin mattresses, blankets folded with military precision, wooden footlockers lined along the floor. He had walked through those barracks during inspections many times before. He knew the layout almost by memory. But tonight the place felt different because of the sound moving through it. The singer held the final note of the melody for a moment longer before letting it drift away into silence. For a few seconds nothing followed. The cold air returned to its normal quiet rhythm. Daniel thought the moment had ended. Then the voice began again, this time softer than before. The new melody moved slower, almost like a lullaby. Private Hayes lifted his eyebrows slightly. Second song, he whispered. Daniel gave the faintest nod. He realized something then that had not occurred to him during the first melody. The voice did not sound frightened. It did not carry the tight breath of someone singing under pressure or under watch. The singer sounded calm, intentional, as if the rest of the camp outside those walls did not matter for those few minutes. Daniel looked up toward the watchtower where a guard stood under the yellow lantern glow with his coat collar turned against the cold wind. Even from that distance, the guard's posture showed that he too was listening. No alarm had been raised. No whistle had been blown. The song simply existed in the open air, drifting across the gravel yard as if the camp had quietly agreed to allow it. Daniel finally stepped back toward the patrol line and spoke in a voice low enough to remain inside their circle. We will stay here for a minute. Private Bell nodded. Private Hayes folded his arms against the cold and kept his eyes on the barrack door. No one asked why. The reason seemed obvious without explanation. Inside the building, the singer continued the gentle melody, and now the men could hear something else between the notes. A weak voice responding. A few quiet words. The tone was fragile, the way a person might sound when exhaustion had taken most of their strength. Daniel understood then. The song was not meant for an audience. It was meant for one person inside that room. The patrol stood there long enough for the frost to gather more thickly along the wooden railing beside the path. Daniel glanced down at his watch. Nearly 10 minutes had passed since the singing first reached their ears. 10 minutes during which the patrol had not taken a single step. That alone was unusual enough to make a report in the morning logbook. But Daniel felt no urgency to explain it yet. The second melody finally softened into a quiet hum and then faded away completely. For several seconds afterward, the yard remained silent again. The wind shifted direction and brushed across the fence wire, producing a faint metallic whisper. Private Hayes exhaled slowly and rubbed his gloved hands together. Well, he said quietly, that was something. Daniel looked once more at the barrack wall, half expecting the voice to begin again. But the building remained still now. Whatever comfort the singer had been offering inside had finished its work. He turned back toward the gravel path and gave a small motion with his hand. The patrol resumed walking. Their boots moved across the frozen gravel with careful steps, the crunching sound returning to the yard as if the world had resumed its normal pace. But something had changed in the men as they moved along the fence line. None of them spoke loudly. None of them joked the way they usually did during the quiet hours of the night shift. They simply walked beneath the pale moon and listened to the cold wind passing over the empty fields beyond the camp. Daniel Mercer glanced once over his shoulder at Barrack 7 as they moved away. The windows still glowed faintly with lantern light behind its frosted glass. He did not know the name of the woman who had been singing inside that building. He did not know the person she had been comforting either. But he knew one simple fact that would remain with him long after the patrol finished its route that night. For 10 quiet minutes in the middle of a guarded camp surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, a single voice had been enough to stop an entire patrol of soldiers where they stood. The patrol finished its route along the northern fence line and circled slowly back toward the center of the camp, but the quiet that followed them felt different now, as if the night itself had absorbed the memory of the voice they had heard only minutes earlier. Corporal Daniel Mercer walked a few steps ahead of the others, the steady crunch of gravel under his boots returning to the rhythm of routine, yet his mind remained back beside the wooden wall of Barrack 7 where the song had drifted through the cracks like warm air escaping a winter house. The wind had grown colder as the hour moved toward midnight, brushing across the open farmland beyond the fences and carrying the dry scent of harvested fields that stretched for miles across the Midwest. Daniel knew those fields well even though he had never worked them. They looked almost identical to the land back home in Kansas, where his father still ran a small wheat farm along a dirt road that rarely saw more than 2 trucks in a day. On nights like this, he could almost imagine he was walking a fence line back home, checking gates before winter frost set into the ground. But the tall watchtowers, the rows of barracks, and the wire fences reminded him that this place followed different rules. The patrol reached the corner of the gravel yard where the path split toward the motor shed and the supply building. Private Leonard Hayes finally spoke again, his voice low but curious. Corporal, you think we should mention that in the log? Daniel kept walking for several seconds before answering. The lantern near the supply building flickered gently in the wind, casting a warm yellow circle across the frozen ground. Mention what exactly? Hayes shrugged slightly. A prisoner singing after lights out. Daniel considered that. On paper the rules were clear. Barracks were supposed to remain quiet once the lanterns were dimmed for the night. Guards could investigate any unusual noise. Reports could be filed. Warnings could be issued through the interpreter the next morning. But what they had heard did not feel like a violation of discipline. It had sounded more like someone holding the night together for another person who needed it. Daniel finally said, "We will note that the patrol heard activity in Barrack 7 and that the situation resolved without issue." Private Hayes gave a small nod. The answer seemed to satisfy the rulebook without disturbing the moment they had witnessed. The patrol continued past the motor shed where a line of parked trucks rested under a thin layer of frost. Their metal frames creaked softly as the temperature dropped another degree. Somewhere in the distance a train horn sounded across the plains, long and low, echoing through the cold air before fading again into the horizon. Private Thomas Bell glanced toward the barracks behind them. "Who do you think it was?" he asked quietly. Daniel did not answer immediately. The question had crossed his mind as well. The camp held a few dozen female prisoners in the eastern compound, most of them former nurses or communications clerks who had been transferred through several holding stations before arriving here earlier that year. During daytime work details, he had occasionally seen them crossing the yard in small groups under supervision, their gray uniforms moving in quiet lines between the laundry building and the kitchen barracks. They rarely spoke loudly. They followed instructions carefully. Many of them carried themselves with the same tired discipline Daniel had seen in soldiers returning from overseas assignments. Whoever had been singing tonight likely belonged to that group, but there had been something distinctive about the voice. Calm without hesitation, confident without effort, the kind of tone that could steady a room without raising its volume. Daniel said finally, someone who knew the person listening needed it. The patrol slowed near the administration building where a single lantern burned beside the door. The light revealed the frost that had begun forming across the wooden steps and railings. Private Hayes rubbed his hands together and blew warm breath into his gloves. "You think it was a lullaby?" he asked. Daniel glanced back across the yard toward Barrack 7. From this distance the building looked like any other structure in the compound, quiet and still beneath the moonlight. The window that had glowed earlier now showed only darkness behind its frosted glass. Whatever had happened inside had settled into sleep. "Could have been," Daniel said. "Or just a song someone remembered." Hayes tilted his head thoughtfully. "Funny thing is I did not understand a single word, but it sounded familiar somehow." Daniel gave a faint smile at that. "Music does that," he said. The patrol resumed its loop along the inner fence. The rhythm of the shift slowly returned to normal as the men checked the gates, glanced at the watchtowers, and passed the quiet rows of buildings. Yet the memory of the voice remained in the air like the last vibration of a bell long after it had been struck. When they passed the eastern compound again, nearly 20 minutes later, Daniel slowed slightly. As they approached Barrack 7, the gravel path looked the same as before. The wooden boards stood silent. The lantern in the watchtower above the yard glowed steadily. But Daniel noticed something new. One of the small windows near the corner of the building showed the faintest sliver of light again, as if a lantern had been lifted or turned slightly inside. The patrol stopped naturally without needing a signal this time. Hayes looked toward Daniel. Daniel listened carefully. No singing came through the walls now. Only the quiet movement of someone adjusting blankets or turning on a bunk frame. The night had returned to its usual stillness. Daniel exhaled slowly and nodded toward the path ahead. "All right," he said softly. "We keep moving." The men resumed walking once more, boots steady against the gravel. But as they moved away from the barrack, Daniel glanced back one last time at the faint glow behind the frosted glass. Somewhere inside that wooden building a woman had chosen to sing instead of letting the night grow heavier for someone who was struggling through it. It was a small decision, a quiet act that would never appear in official reports or military records. Yet for a few minutes earlier that night it had changed the behavior of every soldier standing outside that wall. Daniel Mercer did not know the singer's name yet. He did not know her story or how far she had traveled before reaching this cold American camp surrounded by wheat fields and wire fences. But as the patrol continued along its route beneath the pale moon and the endless Midwestern sky, He found himself thinking that the voice inside Barrack 7 had carried something stronger than rules, stronger than distance, stronger even than the quiet authority of the guards outside. It had carried the simple reminder that even in a place built for watchfulness and order, one human voice could still reach across a wall and change the way the night felt for everyone who heard it. Morning arrived slowly over the prisoner camp, the pale light of early dawn spreading across the flat fields beyond the wire fences like a thin sheet of silver. Frost still clung to the wooden railings and gravel paths, sparkling faintly as the first sunlight reached the yard. The night patrol had ended less than an hour earlier, and Corporal Daniel Mercer stood beside the small guard station near the eastern compound, holding a metal mug of hot coffee that steamed against the cold air. The warmth rose slowly into his hands while the camp began its quiet transition from darkness to routine. A bell rang somewhere near the mess building, not loud, but clear enough to signal the beginning of the morning schedule. Doors opened along the rows of barracks as guards prepared the prisoners for breakfast roll call. The sounds were familiar now. Boots on gravel, hinges creaking, a distant tractor starting up on the far side of the supply shed where the day work crews would soon be assigned. Daniel watched the eastern compound carefully as the first line of prisoners stepped out from Barrack 7. They moved in an orderly row under the watch of a nearby guard, their gray uniforms plain against the pale winter sky. Most of them kept their eyes lowered as they walked toward the roll call area, their breath visible in the cold air, just like the soldiers standing nearby. Daniel did not move. He simply watched the line pass through the gate. Somewhere among those women was the voice he had heard the night before. But in the daylight, there was nothing remarkable about the group at first glance. They looked like any other prisoners adjusting their coats against the cold morning wind. Some were older. Some were barely past their early 20s. Their steps remained quiet and disciplined as they crossed the gravel yard. Private Leonard Hayes approached from behind Daniel, carrying his own mug of coffee. "Morning, Corporal," he said, his voice still heavy with the early hour. Daniel nodded. "Morning." Hayes followed Daniel's gaze toward the line forming near the roll call post. "You looking for her too?" he asked quietly. Daniel did not pretend otherwise. "Maybe," he said. Hayes leaned one shoulder against the wooden wall of the guard station and studied the prisoners with mild curiosity. "Hard to imagine that voice coming from someone in that line," he said. Daniel understood what he meant. In the quiet darkness of the night, the singer had sounded almost larger than the Barrack itself, her voice carrying calm through the cold air with a kind of quiet strength. Now the women standing in formation looked small against the wide sky and the long fence lines that stretched across the camp. "Hey!" Guard called out instructions near the front of the line. The prisoners responded with a brief acknowledgement before settling into stillness for the morning count. Daniel stepped slightly forward so he could see the faces more clearly. The sun had climbed high enough now to reveal details that the lantern light of the night had hidden. One woman near the center of the group caught his attention. She stood a little apart from the others, not by distance, but by posture. While most of the prisoners held themselves stiffly against the cold, she appeared calm, her shoulders relaxed as she adjusted a thin wool scarf around her neck. Her hair was tied back simply, the pale strands catching the morning light. She spoke quietly to the woman beside her, who looked pale and tired but steadier than someone who had struggled through a difficult night. Daniel felt a quiet certainty settle in his mind. That must be her. He did not know how he knew. Perhaps it was the way the other woman leaned slightly closer as they stood in line, as if still listening to the memory of the voice that had comforted her only hours earlier. Private Hayes followed Daniel's gaze. "You see someone?" he asked. Daniel kept his eyes on the formation. "Possibly." Hayes studied the group for a moment longer before nodding slowly. "The one with the scarf?" he asked. Daniel did not answer directly, but his silence was enough confirmation. The roll call officer stepped forward and began reading numbers while a guard checked names against the morning ledger. The prisoners responded one by one, their voices low but clear in the cold air. When the count reached the center of the line, the woman with the scarf stepped forward slightly and spoke her number with careful English pronunciation. Her voice was calm and steady. Daniel recognized it immediately. It carried the same tone he had heard through the Barrack wall the night before. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Hayes glanced at Daniel with a small look of surprise. "Well," he murmured, "that answers that." The count continued until the final prisoner confirmed her number. The officer closed the ledger and gave a brief signal for the line to move toward the mess hall for breakfast. The formation loosened as the women began walking across the yard in pairs under guard supervision. As they passed the guard station, the woman with the scarf glanced briefly toward the building. It was a quick look, no more than a second. But in that moment her eyes met Daniel's. There was no fear in her expression. No challenge either. Only quiet awareness. As if she understood that the men outside the barrack the night before had heard her voice and had chosen not to interrupt it. The moment passed almost immediately. She turned back toward the mess hall line and continued walking beside the tired woman she had been supporting earlier. Hayes exhaled softly. "Think she knows?" he asked. Daniel watched the two prisoners disappear into the breakfast line near the mess building. The smell of hot oatmeal and fresh coffee drifted across the yard as the kitchen crew opened the serving windows. "I think she might," Daniel said quietly. Hayes took another sip of his coffee and shook his head with mild disbelief. "Strange thing about that," he said. "Last night it felt like the whole camp stopped breathing for a minute." Daniel nodded slowly. The memory of the voice still echoed in his thoughts even under the bright morning sky. "Sometimes," he said, "people forget that the quiet moments carry farther than the loud ones." The camp continued its routine around them as the prisoners entered the mess hall and the guards returned to their morning posts. Trucks rumbled to life near the supply shed, preparing to transport the work crews to nearby farms later in the day. The watchtower lanterns were extinguished as daylight took full control of the sky. But for Corporal Daniel Mercer, the morning held a new awareness that had not been there before. Somewhere inside that mess hall the woman with the calm voice was beginning another ordinary day inside the camp. And though the fences and rules remained exactly the same as they had been the night before, Daniel understood that the memory of that song would continue moving quietly through the camp long after the frost melted from the gravel paths. The camp moved into its full daytime rhythm as the morning sun climbed higher over the open fields beyond the wire fences, warming the frost that had covered the gravel paths only an hour earlier. Corporal Daniel Mercer remained near the guard station for several minutes after the prisoners entered the mess hall, watching the quiet flow of routine settle into place across the compound. Trucks idled near the supply shed, their engines humming softly, while drivers checked fuel levels and cargo space for the work crews that would soon be transported to nearby farms. The smell of breakfast drifted across the yard. Oatmeal, fresh bread, and strong coffee carried through the cold air from the kitchen windows. Daniel finished the last sip from his metal mug and set it on the wooden ledge beside the guard station door. Private Leonard Hayes stretched his shoulders and glanced toward the mess hall where the line of prisoners slowly disappeared through the entrance. "You think she sings like that every night?" he asked. Daniel considered the question. The voice from the night before had not sounded rehearsed or practiced for an audience. It had sounded personal, intentional. "I do not think it was meant for every night," Daniel said quietly. Hayes nodded. "Probably just for whoever needed it." The bell near the mess building rang again, signaling that the kitchen crew had begun serving the second wave of breakfast trays. Guards moved along the path directing prisoners toward the correct entrances while others prepared the daily work rosters. Daniel stepped away from the guard station and walked slowly toward the administrative board where assignments for the day were being posted. The morning sun reflected off the glass covering the notice sheet, forcing him to tilt his head slightly to read the list. Several of the female prisoners from the eastern compound had been assigned to kitchen assistance and laundry duty for the day. Others would help sort produce that had arrived from nearby farms supplying the camp kitchen. It was ordinary work, necessary tasks that kept the place running smoothly. Daniel scanned the list until one name near the middle caught his attention. Anna Weiss. The name was written neatly beside the assignment for the laundry building. Daniel did not know with certainty that it belonged to the woman he had seen in line earlier, but something in his memory suggested that it might. Hayes stepped beside him and glanced at the board as well. "Laundry detail today," Hayes said. "Not the worst job on a cold morning." Daniel nodded. "Inside work is easier when the wind picks up." The two men stood quietly for a moment before the mess hall door opened again and the first group of prisoners began stepping back outside. Some carried trays to return to the kitchen window, while others headed directly toward the yard where work details would soon assemble. The woman Daniel had noticed earlier appeared again near the center of the group. The wool scarf remained wrapped around her neck, and she walked beside the same pale woman who had looked unsteady during roll call. This time the second woman moved with more strength in her steps. Daniel noticed that immediately. Whatever had troubled her during the night seemed to have eased. Hayes followed Daniel's gaze again. "Looks like your singer helped someone through the night," he said. Daniel watched the pair cross the gravel yard toward the laundry building at the far side of the compound. "Looks that way," he replied. The laundry building stood near the eastern fence, a long wooden structure with tall windows that allowed sunlight to reach the rows of washing basins inside. Steam often drifted from its open vents during the colder months as warm water mixed with the winter air. Daniel had inspected the building several times during previous weeks and knew it smelled constantly of soap and damp fabric. As the two women approached the doorway, the one wearing the scarf paused briefly to adjust the other's coat collar against the wind. It was a small gesture. Quick, almost unnoticeable unless someone happened to be watching closely. Daniel noticed. Hayes noticed as well. "You know," Hayes said quietly, "most people would not expect kindness to travel across enemy lines like that." Daniel rested his hands on his belt and looked across the yard toward the wide farmland beyond the camp fences. The horizon stretched for miles under the pale winter sky, the same open land that farmers nearby depended on for their crops each season. "Most people expect enemies to stay enemies," Daniel said. "But people are more complicated than that." Hayes considered the thought for a moment before nodding slowly. "My mother used to say music could calm a room faster than words," he added. Looks like she might have been right. Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. The camp continued its steady movement around them as the work details assembled. Guards checked names and assignments while the trucks prepared to transport the farm crews out through the main gate. The eastern compound quieted again as the laundry team entered the building and closed the door behind them. A few minutes later, thin ribbons of steam began drifting from the roof vent, curling into the cold air above the structure. Daniel found his attention returning to that building more than once during the next hour. The morning duties demanded focus, yet each time he passed along the path near the eastern fence, he could hear the faint sounds of work from inside. Buckets shifting, fabric moving through water, the quiet rhythm of people completing a necessary task together. Once, while walking past the open window near the rear corner of the building, Daniel heard something else. Not a full song, just a brief hum. A melody too soft to carry beyond the yard, but unmistakably the same calm tone he had heard the night before through the wooden walls of Barrack 7. Daniel did not stop walking. He simply continued along the path, his boots steady against the gravel, as if nothing unusual had reached his ears. But inside his thoughts the sound lingered again like a warm note held in cold air. By late morning the sun had climbed high enough to soften the frost along the ground completely. The yard no longer carried the sharp chill of dawn, and the camp moved through its routine with quiet efficiency. Yet for Corporal Daniel Mercer the day felt slightly different from the ones before it. Somewhere inside the laundry building near the eastern fence a woman named Anna Weiss was moving through her work like every other prisoner assigned to the task. She was washing uniforms, folding blankets, helping keep the camp orderly. Nothing in that routine would appear unusual to anyone reading the daily reports. But Daniel knew that during the previous night her voice had done something that could not be measured in reports or written into ledgers. It had carried calm across a cold yard and into the minds of soldiers who had expected silence. And as the wind moved gently across the camp that morning, lifting the thin steam above the laundry roof and carrying it toward the endless farmland beyond the fences, Daniel understood that the quiet influence of that voice was still moving through the day, even though no one spoke about it aloud. By midday the winter sun had risen high enough to soften the sharp edge of the morning cold, and the prisoner camp settled into the slow, steady rhythm that always came once the first half of the day was underway. Trucks had already carried several work crews out through the main gate toward nearby farms, where harvested fields still needed clearing before the deeper freeze of December arrived. Inside the camp fences, the remaining details continued their assigned tasks with quiet efficiency. Corporal Daniel Mercer walked along the gravel path that ran beside the eastern fence, checking the latches on a storage shed and glancing up occasionally at the watchtower that overlooked the compound. The tower guard leaned against the railing with a pair of binoculars resting against his chest, scanning the distant horizon where rows of bare cornfields stretched mile after mile under a pale blue sky. The wind had eased since morning, leaving the camp wrapped in a calm stillness broken only by the distant rumble of engines and the occasional call of a crow drifting across the farmland. Daniel paused near the laundry building where thin clouds of warm steam continued to rise from the roof vent and dissolve into the cool air. The building had been active for hours now. Inside, the sound of water sloshing in metal basins mixed with the rhythm of cloth being wrung and folded. It was quiet work, but constant, the kind of labor that filled long hours without drawing attention to itself. Daniel moved closer to the open side window where sunlight spilled across the wooden sill and illuminated the damp floorboards inside. He did not stop completely. Guards were not supposed to linger too long beside work details unless inspection was necessary. But he slowed his pace enough to let his eyes adjust to the interior. Several women worked along the row of washing stations, sleeves rolled slightly above their wrists as they moved uniforms through the warm water. The smell of soap drifted out through the open window, mixing with the clean scent of damp cotton fabric drying on the lines stretched across the room. Among them, Daniel recognized the same pale scarf from earlier that morning. Anna Weiss stood near the center basin, her hands moving steadily through the water as she rinsed a stack of work shirts and passed them to another prisoner waiting beside her. The woman who had appeared weak during the morning roll call now stood only a few feet away, folding dry garments into careful stacks. She looked stronger than she had earlier, her movements more confident as she worked beside the others. Daniel noticed something else as well. The women spoke quietly among themselves in German, their voices low and practical as they moved from basin to drying line and back again. But once every few minutes Anna hummed softly under her breath. It was not loud enough to travel far beyond the room. The melody remained gentle and private, drifting no farther than the wooden beams above the washing stations. Yet Daniel recognized the tone immediately. The same calm rhythm, the same steady breath that had carried through the Barrack wall the night before. He continued walking along the path, careful not to make it obvious that he had noticed. The gravel crunched under his boots as he reached the corner of the building and turned toward the fence gate that separated the work yard from the main compound. Private Leonard Hayes stood near the gate post with a clipboard tucked under his arm, checking off assignments for the afternoon shift. "Laundry crew holding up fine," Hayes said as Daniel approached. "They will probably finish early if they keep that pace." Daniel glanced briefly toward the building again. "Looks organized," he replied. Hayes followed his line of sight and lowered his voice slightly. "She is in there again," he said. Daniel nodded. "I saw." Hayes shifted his weight against the gate post and scratched the side of his jaw thoughtfully. "Funny thing about that humming," he said quietly. "Even through the window, you can almost feel it change the room." Daniel looked back across the yard toward the endless farmland beyond the wire fence. The open land had always been one of the strangest parts of this assignment. Prisoners held behind fences while the surrounding world remained wide and quiet, stretching beyond sight in every direction. "Some people carry calm with them wherever they go," Daniel said. Hayes gave a small shrug. "Wish we had more of that during night watch sometimes." A few minutes later the laundry door opened, and one of the guards assigned to supervise the work detail stepped outside to stretch his legs. The warm air from the building followed him briefly before the door swung closed again. From inside the room the faint humming continued for another moment, then blended back into the ordinary rhythm of work. The afternoon moved slowly after that. Sunlight drifted across the yard, shifting shadows from one side of the buildings to the other while the remaining camp crews finished their tasks. Daniel completed 2 more rounds along the fence line and checked the supply shed inventory before returning toward the eastern compound again. When he passed the laundry building for the 3rd time that day, the humming had faded, replaced by the sound of wooden crates being stacked near the door. The work detail was finishing. A guard opened the door and motioned for the prisoners to carry the folded uniforms toward the storage racks outside. One by one the women stepped into the afternoon light, holding neat stacks of freshly washed clothing. Anna Weiss emerged among them. Her scarf loosened slightly now that the day had grown warmer. She carried a bundle of uniforms across the yard with the same calm posture Daniel had noticed earlier. As she passed the fence gate where Hayes stood, she paused long enough to adjust the pile in her arms. Hayes stepped aside to give her room to pass and gave a polite nod, the kind guards sometimes offered when routine allowed a brief moment of ordinary civility. Anna returned the nod with quiet respect before continuing toward the storage rack. Daniel watched from several yards away. There was nothing unusual about the exchange. No word spoken. No rule broken. Just two people acknowledging one another during the ordinary flow of work inside a camp built on order and distance. Yet the moment carried the same quiet weight as the song from the night before. When the final bundles were stacked and the laundry detail finished their task, the women were guided back toward the eastern barracks to prepare for the evening schedule. The yard gradually emptied again as the sun lowered toward the horizon and long shadows stretched across the gravel paths. Daniel remained near the fence gate for a few minutes longer, looking toward Barrack 7 where the lanterns would soon be lit again for the coming night. Somewhere inside that building, the same woman whose voice had stopped a patrol of soldiers only hours earlier would likely return to her bunk and settle into another quiet evening behind the wooden walls. The rules of the camp would remain the same. The fences would remain exactly where they were. But Daniel Mercer understood something now that he had not considered before the previous night. Sometimes the smallest sound inside those walls could travel farther than anyone expected, reaching beyond the barracks, beyond the gravel paths, and into the quiet thoughts of the people standing watch outside. Evening returned slowly to the prisoner camp as the sun lowered toward the endless flat horizon of the Midwest, and the sky shifted from pale blue to the soft copper tones that often appeared over harvested farmland in late autumn. The long shadows of the watchtowers stretched across the gravel yard, reaching toward the rows of wooden barracks like dark fingers slowly sliding over the ground. Corporal Daniel Mercer walked his second inspection round of the day along the eastern fence line, his boots steady against the gravel while the cold air began to gather again across the open land beyond the wire. The trucks that had carried work crews out to the farms earlier that morning had returned not long ago, their engines now quiet beside the supply shed as the drivers completed their logs and locked the vehicle doors for the night. A few prisoners crossed the yard under guard supervision, returning tools to the storage racks before evening roll call. The camp moved through its final routine of the day with the same calm efficiency it had shown every evening since Daniel had been assigned to the post. Lanterns flickered on one by one along the barrack doors as the light faded from the sky. The air carried the faint smell of supper drifting from the mess hall, simple food prepared for both guards and prisoners alike. Daniel paused briefly near the eastern compound gate, where Private Leonard Hayes leaned against the wooden post watching the yard with quiet attention. Hayes nodded toward the darkening sky. "Looks like the cold is coming back tonight," he said. Daniel followed his gaze across the fields. A thin gray band of clouds had appeared along the distant horizon, stretching across miles of farmland like a low curtain pulled slowly across the evening sky. "Temperature will drop after sunset," Daniel said. Hayes folded his arms inside his coat and shifted his stance against the gate. "Good night for staying inside the barracks," he added. The two men stood in silence for a moment as the final groups of prisoners moved toward their buildings. Among them Daniel again noticed the familiar scarf tied loosely around the neck of Anna Weiss as she walked beside the same woman she had supported earlier in the day. The pair moved calmly through the gravel yard and stepped into Barrack 7 with the rest of the group, just as the lantern near the door flickered to life above the entrance. The door closed behind them with a quiet wooden thud. Evening roll call followed soon after. Guards read numbers from their ledgers while prisoners answered in turn, their voices steady in the cool air as the final count of the day was confirmed. Once the count matched the records, the officer closed the ledger and gave a short nod that signaled the end of the formal procedure. The camp relaxed slightly after that. Guards shifted into their night watch rotations while prisoners returned to the routines of the evening inside the barracks. Daniel's patrol began shortly afterward. He and Hayes walked the same path they had followed the night before, moving along the gravel line between the buildings while the watchtower lantern cast a pale circle of light across the yard. The wind had returned with the coming darkness, brushing softly against the wooden walls and rattling the loose ends of fence wire in quiet metallic whispers. For nearly 20 minutes the patrol continued without interruption. The camp remained still except for the occasional creak of wood and the distant sound of a train passing somewhere far beyond the fields. Daniel felt the familiar rhythm of the patrol settle into his steps again. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, he remained aware of the building ahead of them. Barrack 7 waited quietly along the path, just as it had the night before. Hayes seemed to notice the same thought forming. "You think we will hear it again?" he asked softly as they approached the corner of the gravel yard. Daniel did not answer right away. The building stood silent beneath the lantern light, its windows glowing faintly through thin curtains drawn across the glass. The patrol moved a few steps closer. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the cold scent of distant farmland through the yard. Then something familiar touched the air. At first, it was barely more than a breath of sound drifting from the direction of the Barrack wall. Hayes stopped walking. Daniel lifted one hand instinctively, signaling the patrol to pause just as he had done the night before. The men froze in place along the gravel path. The sound came again, clearer, now though still soft enough to blend with the wind. A voice. Not loud. Not meant for the yard outside the building. The melody rose gently through the wooden boards, steady and calm as it drifted into the night air. Hayes let out a quiet breath of recognition. "That is her again," he whispered. Daniel stepped slowly toward the Barrack wall, his boots careful against the frozen ground so the sound would not interrupt the moment. The song carried the same patient rhythm as before. Not a performance, not a show of defiance, just a quiet melody moving through the darkness as if it belonged there. Through the narrow gaps between the wooden planks, Daniel could hear faint movement inside the room. Someone shifting on a bunk frame. The soft rustle of blankets. And the voice continuing its gentle rise and fall above those sounds like a steady light guiding someone through a long night. The patrol remained perfectly still behind him. Even the guard in the distant watchtower leaned slightly against the railing, listening without moving. The melody flowed through the cold air for several minutes without interruption. It felt almost as though the camp itself had paused again, allowing the sound to pass through its fences and watch posts without resistance. Daniel realized something as he listened this time. The song was not exactly the same as the one from the previous night. The melody followed a similar pattern, but the phrasing shifted slightly with each line as though the singer adjusted the rhythm to match the breathing of the person she was comforting. It was careful work, patient work. Hayes looked toward him with a thoughtful expression. "Same place tomorrow night?" Hayes asked quietly as they resumed their walk along the gravel path. Daniel glanced once more at the faint glow of lantern light behind the window of Barrack 7 before turning toward the dark fence line ahead. "Probably," he said. And as the patrol continued its route beneath the cold autumn sky, the memory of the voice followed them once again through the quiet yard, moving softly through the camp like a sound that belonged there even though no rule had ever written it down. The patrol continued past Barrack 7, but the silence that followed the fading song carried a different weight now, as if the sound had left a quiet imprint across the gravel yard, and the men walking through it could still feel the outline of it in the cold air. Corporal Daniel Mercer kept his pace steady along the fence line, though his attention drifted back more than once toward the wooden building behind them. The lantern above its door glowed softly against the dark boards, and the narrow windows held the faint warmth of light from inside where the prisoners had settled into their bunks for the night. The wind brushed across the open farmland beyond the camp, moving through the wire fences with a thin metallic whisper that rose and faded again like distant surf against a quiet shore. Glanced up. Quiet enough. The guard nodded and returned to scanning the dark horizon beyond the fences. For several minutes the patrol moved without speaking. The routine of the night watch returned slowly to their steps, though the calm mood of the earlier moment lingered. Daniel found himself listening to the ordinary sounds of the camp with new attention. The creak of wood as the wind shifted. The distant engine of a freight train moving somewhere across the plains. Even the faint rustle of blankets through a Barrack window seemed sharper now that he knew what could rise from that quiet. When they completed the loop along the supply shed and returned toward the eastern compound again, Hayes slowed his pace slightly, paused for a moment before writing the final line. Then he closed the ledger without adding anything more. Some things did not belong in the official report. Hayes noticed the hesitation and smiled faintly as he hung his coat on the rack near the door. "Guess the song stays off the record," he said. Daniel set the pen down beside the logbook. "Some things travel farther when they are not written down," he replied. The two men stepped outside again as the next patrol prepared to take over the watch. The camp looked almost peaceful under the cold starlight, its rows of wooden barracks resting quietly against the open land that surrounded them. Daniel walked slowly toward the path leading back to his quarters, his boots crunching softly against the frozen gravel. As he passed the eastern compound, he glanced once more toward Barrack 7. The lantern had been dimmed now, leaving only a thin ribbon of light along the bottom edge of the door. Inside, the women had likely settled into sleep. Somewhere among them, Anna Weiss lay on her bunk after another long day of work in the laundry building. Daniel wondered briefly whether she knew how far her voice had traveled the night before and again tonight. Not across miles of land, not beyond the fences, but across something else entirely. Across the quiet distance between two groups of people who had been taught to stand apart from one another. The wind moved again through the fence wire, carrying the dry scent of winter fields toward the barracks. Daniel continued walking until the path curved out of sight of the eastern compound. Yet the memory of the voice remained with him, steady and calm like the echo of a melody that had already faded from the air but refused to disappear from the mind of anyone who had heard it. Morning returned with a thin gray light spreading slowly across the open farmland beyond the fences, and the prisoner camp stirred awake under a sky that promised another cold day. Frost had gathered again along the gravel paths during the night, turning every step into a crisp sound as guards moved between the barracks preparing for roll call. Corporal Daniel Mercer stepped out of the guard quarters with a fresh mug of coffee warming his hands while the early air brushed across his coat collar. The events of the previous nights had not changed the routines of the camp. The bell still rang near the mess hall. Doors still opened along the rows of wooden buildings. Guards still checked their ledgers and counted every prisoner with careful precision. The farm crews. Daniel scanned the sheet of assignments until he saw the familiar name once more. Anna Weiss had been assigned to kitchen duty for the day instead of the laundry building. Hayes pointed at the board with the end of his pencil. "Looks like the singer is moving to the mess hall today," he said. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. The kitchen building sat closer to the center of the camp than the laundry shed, and its windows often remained open during the morning hours to release the heat from the cooking stoves. It meant that sounds from inside sometimes carried into the yard more easily. A short time later, the kitchen team began their shift. Daniel walked past the building during his inspection round and noticed the warm light spilling through the wide windows. Inside, several prisoners moved between long wooden tables preparing vegetables and sorting bread loaves for the noon meal. Anna stood near the far counter rinsing large metal bowls while another worker stacked trays beside her. The kitchen carried a constant mixture of smells that morning. Boiling potatoes, fresh bread, strong coffee warming in tall metal containers. Daniel slowed slightly as he passed the open window. The clatter of dishes and quiet conversation filled the room. Then beneath those ordinary sounds he heard it again. Not a full melody this time, just a brief hum, soft enough that it blended with the rhythm of work inside the kitchen. Yet the tone carried the same steady calm that had stopped the patrol outside Barrack 7 2 nights earlier. Daniel continued walking along the path, without looking directly toward the window. Guards were expected to move with purpose, not curiosity. Still, the sound followed him for several steps as the breeze lifted it gently into the yard. Hayes caught up with him near the storage shed a few minutes later. "You heard that too," Hayes said quietly. Daniel gave a small nod. "Yes." Hayes leaned against the fence post and glanced back toward the kitchen building. "Strange thing," he said. "The place actually sounds calmer when she hums like that." Daniel looked across the yard where several prisoners were stacking crates of produce beside the supply truck. The camp moved with the same disciplined routine it always had. Yet Hayes was not wrong. Something about the presence of that quiet voice seemed to smooth the edges of the morning. As the day continued, Daniel passed the kitchen building 2 more times during his inspection rounds. Each time the work inside continued without interruption, and each time he heard that faint hum drifting through the open window for a few seconds before fading again into the ordinary clatter of dishes. By late afternoon, the sun had warmed the yard enough to melt the remaining frost completely. The farm trucks returned through the gate, carrying the field crews back to the compound. Guards prepared for evening roll call, while the kitchen team finished their final tasks before supper. Anna stepped outside the building with 2 other workers carrying a crate of empty containers toward the storage rack. As she passed the gravel path where Daniel stood, she paused for a moment to adjust the scarf around her neck against the cooling air. For the first time she spoke directly, her English careful but clear. "Good afternoon, Corporal." Daniel felt a brief moment of surprise before answering. "Good afternoon." The exchange lasted no more than a few seconds before the other workers continued toward the storage rack, and Anna followed them. Hayes raised an eyebrow after she passed. "Well," he said quietly. "Looks like the quiet singer finally said something." Daniel watched her return to the kitchen door before replying. "Just a greeting," he said. Hayes smiled slightly. "Still," he added, "not every day you hear the voice that stopped a whole patrol and then get a good afternoon from it the next morning." The sun lowered slowly toward the horizon again as the camp prepared for another evening. Lanterns would soon be lit above the Barrack doors. The patrol route would begin again along the gravel path. And somewhere inside Barrack 7 a calm voice might once more rise through the wooden boards into the cold night air. Daniel Mercer did not know whether that would happen again or not. But as he walked along the fence line beneath the wide American sky, he knew that if it did, the soldiers outside would probably stop and listen once more. Evening settled once again over the prisoner camp as the sun dipped behind the long horizon of the Midwest and the skies softened into deep shades of amber and blue. The open farmland surrounding the compound grew quiet beneath the cooling air, and a thin wind moved across the fields carrying the scent of dry soil and distant barns. Inside the fences, the familiar rhythm of the camp continued. Trucks returned to their parking line beside the motor shed. Guards exchanged brief reports before beginning their night rotations. Lanterns flickered to life above the Barrack doors one by one, casting warm circles of light across the gravel paths as darkness slowly replaced the fading daylight. Corporal Daniel Mercer walked along the eastern fence line with the calm pace of someone who had followed the same path many times before, yet the quiet exchange earlier that afternoon remained in his thoughts. The simple greeting from Anna Weiss had been brief and ordinary, but it had changed something subtle in the way the evening felt. The woman whose voice had carried through the Barrack walls now had a name and a presence beyond the memory of a melody in the night air. Private Leonard Hayes joined Daniel near the compound gate, adjusting the collar of his coat against the growing cold. "Temperature is dropping fast again," Hayes said, glancing toward the pale band of clouds stretching across the western horizon. Daniel nodded. "Clear skies after sunset usually mean colder air," he replied. Hayes shifted his weight and looked toward the rows of barracks where prisoners were finishing supper before evening roll call. "Think we will hear it again tonight?" he asked quietly. Daniel considered the question for a moment. The previous nights had shown a pattern, but not one that felt predictable. The songs had not been performances. They had been quiet responses to someone else's need. "Maybe," Daniel said, "if someone inside needs it." The bell near the mess hall rang shortly afterward, signaling the prisoners to return to their buildings for the evening count. Lines formed again in the gravel yard, their shadows stretching long beneath the lantern light as guards read numbers from their ledgers. Anna Weiss stood among the women of Barrack 7, her scarf wrapped lightly around her neck as the cold air settled across the yard. When her number was called, she answered in the same calm tone Daniel had heard before. The count ended without incident, and the prisoners returned inside their barracks while the guards began the transition into night watch. The yard grew still again as the doors closed and the lanterns outside the buildings dimmed slightly to conserve fuel through the long night. Hours. Daniel's patrol began shortly afterward. Hayes and 2 other soldiers followed him along the gravel route that circled the eastern compound. The sky above the camp had cleared completely now, revealing a wide field of stars that seemed almost close enough to touch. The cold air sharpened every sound. The crunch of boots, the faint rattle of fence wire, even the distant whistle of a train moving somewhere across the plains carried clearly through the night. When the patrol approached Barrack 7 again, the building appeared quiet at first glance. Lantern light glowed faintly through the curtained windows, and the wind brushed softly against the wooden walls. Hayes slowed slightly as they walked. "Nothing yet," he murmured. Daniel raised a hand gently, signaling the patrol to continue without stopping. They passed the building and turned along the path toward the northern fence line. For nearly 15 minutes, the patrol moved through the camp without interruption. The watchtower guard called down once to confirm the time. The supply shed door creaked slightly in the wind. Otherwise, the night held its steady silence. Then, just as the patrol returned toward the eastern compound again, something touched the air behind them. The sound came softly at first, so faint that it might have been mistaken for the wind moving through the fence wire. But the tone carried a rhythm too steady to be anything but a voice. Hayes stopped walking immediately. Daniel raised his hand once more. The patrol froze in place along the gravel path. The melody rose gently from the direction of Barrack 7, drifting through the wooden boards and into the cold air like a thin thread of warmth moving through the night. The voice sounded slightly different this time. Still calm, still steady, but softer than before, almost like a whisper wrapped inside a melody. Daniel stepped slowly toward the Barrack wall and listened carefully. Through the narrow gaps in the wood, he could hear the faint rustle of blankets and a quiet voice answering in weak tones between the lines of the song. Someone inside was struggling with sleep again. The melody moved patiently above those sounds, never rising high enough to disturb the rest of the room. Hayes stood several feet behind Daniel, his breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. "She does not stop, does she?" he whispered. Daniel kept his eyes on the dim lantern glow behind the Barrack window. "Not when someone needs her," he said softly. The song continued for several minutes. The patrol remained motionless, just as they had the previous nights. Even the watchtower guard leaned forward slightly over the railing, listening to the quiet melody drifting through the compound. The cold wind carried the sound across the gravel yard and toward the fences before letting it fade gently into the open farmland beyond. When the final note ended, the silence returned slowly, settling across the camp like fresh snow covering the ground. Daniel lowered his hand and stepped back toward the patrol line. Hayes glanced toward the Barrack door where the lantern light flickered faintly. "You ever think about how strange this is?" Hayes asked quietly as they resumed walking. Daniel looked ahead along the gravel path that stretched between the dark buildings. "What part?" he asked. Hayes shrugged slightly. "A camp full of soldiers and prisoners," he said. "And the quietest thing in the whole place is the sound that changes everything for a few minutes." Daniel thought about that as they walked. The patrol continued along the fence line while the stars burned steadily above the silent fields. Somewhere behind them inside Barrack 7, the woman named Anna Weiss had likely finished her song and returned to the quiet routine of the night, like everyone else inside the building. Yet the memory of the melody followed the patrol once again as they completed their round. Daniel Mercer knew that nothing in the official structure of the camp had changed. The fences still stood where they had been built. The guards still carried out their duties. The prisoners still followed the rules written in the camp regulations. But as the patrol moved through the cold night air beneath the endless Midwestern sky, Daniel understood something that no regulation had ever mentioned. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness inside those wooden walls could reach farther than the fences themselves. Morning came again with a quiet gray light spreading across the fields beyond the fences, and the prisoner camp woke slowly beneath a sky that promised another cold winter day. Frost covered the gravel paths and the wooden railings outside the barracks, turning every step into a crisp sound that echoed faintly between the buildings. Corporal Daniel Mercer stepped out of the guard quarters with his coat buttoned high. Against the cold air, carrying a metal mug of coffee that steamed gently in the early light. The camp followed its usual rhythm. The bell rang near the mess hall. Guards moved toward their posts. Doors opened along the rows of wooden barracks as prisoners prepared for the morning count. Yet the quiet memory of the previous night remained with Daniel as clearly as the frost beneath his boots. When the eastern compound door opened and the women of Barrack 7 stepped into the yard, he found himself watching again with the same calm attention he had carried for the past few days. The line formed beneath the pale sky, gray uniforms blending softly with the color of the cold ground. Anna Weiss stood among them near the center of the formation, the familiar wool scarf wrapped around her neck. The woman she had comforted earlier in the week stood beside her, now fully steady and alert. Private Leonard Hayes joined Daniel near the guard station, holding the morning ledger. 3 nights now, Hayes murmured quietly. Daniel nodded once. 3. The officer began reading numbers from the list while the prisoners answered one by one in careful voices. When Anna's number came, her voice carried across the yard with the same calm tone Daniel recognized from the songs drifting through the Barrack walls each night. The count finished quickly and the formation dissolved as the women walked toward the mess hall for breakfast. Steam rose from the kitchen vents while the smell of coffee and oatmeal drifted across the compound. Daniel remained where he stood, watching the line disappear through the mess hall door. Hayes noticed the direction of his gaze and smiled slightly. "You know what the strange part is?" Hayes said quietly. Daniel glanced toward him. "What?" Hayes shrugged. "At first I thought it was the song that stopped us," he said. "But now I think it was the reason behind it." Daniel considered that thought for a moment while the yard settled into the quieter rhythm that followed breakfast. Guards posted the day's assignments on the board near the administrative building. Trucks started near the motor shed preparing to carry the farm crews beyond the gates. The sky brightened as the sun climbed slowly above the flat farmland. Daniel walked toward the assignment board with Hayes and read through the list of work details. Anna Weiss appeared. Again on the kitchen team for the day. Hayes tapped the paper lightly with the edge of his pencil. "Looks like she is staying close to the center of camp again," he said. Daniel nodded. "Kitchen work is steady." A short time later the kitchen crew began preparing the midday meal. Daniel walked his inspection route past the building just as he had the day before. Warm air drifted through the open windows along with the sounds of metal bowls and quiet conversation. Inside the kitchen, the workers moved between the counters, sorting vegetables and preparing trays for the afternoon shift. Anna stood near the far table measuring flour into a large metal bowl, while another prisoner stirred a pot on the stove nearby. For a moment Daniel heard nothing unusual beyond the normal sounds of work. Then, almost without warning, the same gentle hum returned beneath the rhythm of the room. The melody floated lightly between the clatter of dishes and the soft murmur of voices. Daniel did not stop walking. He simply allowed the sound to follow him a few steps down the path before the breeze carried it away again. Hayes caught up with him near the supply shed a minute later. "You heard it," Hayes said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Hayes folded his arms and leaned against the wooden wall of the shed. "You ever notice how nobody inside that kitchen seems surprised by it?" he asked. Daniel thought about that. "Maybe they have heard it longer than we have," he replied. The afternoon moved slowly through its ordinary tasks. Trucks carried produce from nearby farms into the storage yard. Guards rotated through their posts along the fence line. The kitchen team prepared trays while the laundry crew worked in the building near the eastern fence. Yet beneath those routines, the calm presence of the quiet melody seemed to move through the camp like a steady current. By late afternoon, the sun began lowering again toward the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the yard while the farm trucks returned with the field crews. Supper preparations began in the mess hall, and the prisoners lined up beneath the lantern light once more. Anna stepped outside the kitchen building with a tray of empty containers and carried them toward the storage rack near the path. As she approached the gravel walkway, where Daniel stood checking the gate latch, she paused briefly. "Good evening, Corporal," she said in careful English. Daniel returned the greeting with a calm nod. "Good evening." The exchange lasted only a moment before she continued toward the storage rack with the other workers. Hayes watched the brief conversation and let out a quiet breath. "You know," he said after she walked away, "it is not every day you hear the voice that stopped an entire patrol and then see that same person carrying soup bowls across the yard." Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. "Sometimes the quietest people carry the strongest presence," he said. Evening settled again over the camp as the sky darkened into deep blue above the wide American plains. Lanterns glowed outside the barracks while the cold air returned across the gravel yard. The patrol route would begin again soon, just as it had the previous nights. Somewhere inside Barrack 7, Anna Weiss would eventually return to her bunk after the long day of kitchen work. Whether the melody would rise again that night, Daniel did not know. But as he walked along the fence line beneath the endless sky, he understood something clearly now. The song had never been about music alone. It had been about the quiet choice to bring calm into a place where tension could easily grow. And in a camp built on watchfulness and rules, that small choice had carried farther than anyone expected. The cold evening returned once again to the prisoner camp, settling across the open farmland like a slow breath moving through the wide plains of the American Midwest. The sun slipped below the distant horizon, leaving the sky washed in soft violet and deepening blue, while the first stars began to appear above the watchtowers. Lanterns flickered to life outside the barracks one by one, their warm glow spreading across the gravel yard and the wooden walls that had stood through countless quiet nights. Corporal Daniel Mercer walked his familiar route along the eastern fence line, his boots making the same steady sound against the frozen ground as they had every evening since he arrived at the camp months earlier. Yet the place did not feel exactly the same anymore. The fences were still there. The watchtower guards still scanned the fields beyond the compound. The rules written in the camp ledger had not changed. But something quieter had begun to shape the nights inside those boundaries, something that could not be recorded in reports or measured by routine inspections. Private Leonard Hayes joined Daniel near the gate that led toward the eastern compound, pulling his coat tighter as the wind moved gently across the yard. "Clear sky tonight," Hayes said, glancing upward where the stars were multiplying across the darkening horizon. Daniel followed his gaze for a moment before returning his attention to the barracks ahead. "Cold night for the patrol," he replied calmly. Hayes gave a small smile. "Maybe the song will warm it up again." Daniel did not answer right away. The idea no longer sounded surprising. Over the past few nights the melody had become something the patrol expected without quite admitting it. Not as entertainment, not as defiance, but as a quiet signal that somewhere inside Barrack 7 someone needed calm enough to carry them through another night. Evening roll call began shortly afterward. Prisoners formed their lines in the lantern light while guards read numbers from their ledgers. Anna Weiss stood once again among the women of Barrack 7, her scarf wrapped around her neck as the cold air moved across the yard. When her number was called, her voice carried clearly through the quiet space between the buildings. The count finished without delay, and the prisoners returned inside as the night watch prepared to begin. The yard grew still again. Lanterns dimmed slightly. The wind moved softly along the fences. Daniel's patrol stepped onto the gravel path, their boots echoing faintly beneath the watchtower above them. The routine had become familiar now. Walk the perimeter. Check the gates. Listen to the quiet between the buildings. Yet as the patrol approached Barrack 7, Daniel noticed something unusual. The building's lantern glowed softly above the door as always, but tonight the faint sound of conversation drifted through the wooden walls before the patrol even reached the corner of the yard. The voices were low and indistinct, the kind of quiet talk that often filled the minutes before sleep inside a crowded barrack. Hayes glanced toward the building as they walked. "Sounds like they are still awake tonight," he murmured. Daniel raised a hand gently, slowing the patrol as they moved closer to the wall. The voices faded gradually as the women inside settled into their bunks. For a few moments the yard returned to its usual silence. The wind brushed along the wooden boards and carried the distant call of a night bird from the fields beyond the fences. Then the melody began again. This time it rose more slowly than before, almost as if the singer waited for the room to quiet completely before letting the sound form in the darkness. The first note was barely louder than a breath, yet it carried clearly through the narrow gaps in the barrack wall. Hayes stopped walking immediately. Daniel lifted his hand in the now familiar signal, and the patrol froze along the gravel path beneath the lantern glow. The song moved gently through the cold air, the melody soft but steady as it drifted beyond the wooden boards and into the open yard. Daniel stepped a little closer to the wall, listening carefully. Through the quiet space between the notes, he could hear the faint rustle of blankets and the calm voice of someone speaking softly to another bunk nearby. Anna Weiss was singing again, but tonight the rhythm carried a slightly brighter tone than the previous nights. Not louder, just warmer. Hayes stood a few feet behind Daniel, his breath visible in the cold air. "You hear that?" he whispered. Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes." Hayes tilted his head toward the wall, listening more closely. "Sounds almost like the others are calmer tonight." Daniel realized that Hayes was right. The room beyond the wall felt quieter than it had before, as if the people inside had already grown used to the presence of the song. Instead of tension or restless movement, the barrack held a gentle stillness that allowed the melody to travel easily through the air. The watchtower guard above them leaned forward against the railing, listening just as he had the nights before. No one interrupted. No one moved. For several minutes the song continued beneath the stars. The wind carried the melody across the yard and out toward the endless farmland beyond the fences where the dark fields stretched mile after mile into the night. Daniel found himself thinking about how far the sound might travel if the air were still enough. Not across the country. Not beyond the war that had brought these people together in this unlikely place. but far enough to reach the ears of anyone willing to pause and listen. When the melody finally softened and faded away, the silence returned. Gently to the compound, Daniel lowered his hand and stepped back toward the patrol line. Hayes exhaled slowly. "I think the whole place sleeps easier when she does that," he said quietly. Daniel looked once more at the lantern glowing above the door of Barrack 7. "Maybe it reminds people that someone is still looking out for them," he replied. The patrol resumed walking along the gravel path, their boots steady against the frozen ground as they continued the round beneath the wide winter sky. Behind them, the barrack remained quiet now, its lantern casting a soft circle of light against the wooden wall. Inside, the woman who had been singing had likely returned to her bunk after helping another person find rest in the long cold night. Daniel Mercer walked the rest of his route in thoughtful silence. The camp looked exactly the same as it had before those songs first drifted into the yard. The same fences, the same watchtowers, the same rows of barracks beneath the endless American sky. Yet something inside that quiet place had shifted in a way that no rulebook could describe. The nights no longer belonged only to the guards and their patrols. Sometimes they also belonged to a calm voice rising from behind a wooden wall, reminding everyone who heard it that even inside a camp surrounded by wire and discipline, a small act of kindness could still travel farther than anyone expected. The final hours of that long winter night settled quietly over the prisoner camp, and the cold air moved gently across the wide farmland beyond the fences like a slow tide across an empty shore. Stars filled the sky above the watchtowers, bright and steady in the clear Midwestern darkness, while the lanterns along the barrack doors burned with a softer glow than earlier in the evening. Corporal Daniel Mercer and the patrol finished their round along the eastern compound with the same steady pace they had carried for weeks, but the silence after the song felt deeper now, as if the sound had left a calm space behind it. The gravel path stretched ahead of them between the dark buildings, and the wind carried only the quiet rustle of fence wire and the distant call of a night train somewhere across the plains. Private Leonard Hayes walked beside Daniel with his hands tucked into his coat sleeves. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The patrol completed the final corner of the route near the supply shed and turned back toward the guard station where the next watch would soon replace them. Hayes finally broke the silence. "You know," he said softly, "I do not think I will ever hear that place the same way again." Daniel glanced toward him briefly. "What do you mean?" Hayes looked back across the yard toward Barrack 7, where the lantern above the door glowed faintly against the wood. "Before all this," he said, "a barrack was just a building full of prisoners. Now every time I pass that wall I listen for a song." Daniel understood the thought more clearly than he expected. For the past several nights the patrol had paused beside that same wall while a quiet voice drifted into the cold air, and each time the moment had changed the way the yard felt afterward. Not louder, not dramatic, just calmer. They reached the guard station and recorded the end of the patrol in the ledger. The logbook still held the same simple entries it always had. Weather conditions. Gate inspections complete. No disturbances reported. Daniel closed the book after writing the final line and placed the pen beside it. Hayes watched him and gave a small grin. "Still leaving the music out of the report?" he asked. Daniel nodded once. "Some things are better carried in memory than in paperwork." The next patrol arrived to take over the watch while Daniel and Hayes stepped outside the station into the cold air once more. The eastern compound remained quiet now. Barrack 7 showed only the faint glow of a lantern through the lower edge of its window curtain. Inside, the women had likely settled into sleep after the long day of work and the quiet comfort that had passed through the room only a short time earlier. Daniel walked slowly along the path, leading away from the compound toward the row of guard quarters. His boots moved steadily against the frozen gravel while the wind carried the clean scent of open farmland across the camp. The night looked peaceful from that distance, the rows of buildings resting quietly beneath the wide American sky. Yet Daniel knew that only a few nights earlier the place had felt different, tighter, more mechanical, every movement measured by rules and orders. The songs had not changed those rules. The fences still stood. The guards still followed their rotations. The prisoners still answered their numbers during roll call. But something subtle had shifted in the space between those routines. A reminder that even in a place built on discipline and separation, the quiet gestures of one person could travel across invisible lines. Morning arrived again with a pale silver light spreading across the fields beyond the fences. Frost gathered along the gravel paths as the camp stirred awake for another day. Daniel stepped outside the guard quarters just as the bell rang near the mess hall, signaling the beginning of the morning routine. Prisoners began forming their lines beneath the cold sky, while guards prepared their ledgers for roll call. When the eastern compound door opened and the women of Barrack 7 stepped into the yard, Daniel watched quietly from the guard station. Anna Weiss stood among them once more, the familiar scarf wrapped around her neck. She moved with the same calm posture he had noticed from the first day he heard her voice. The line formed. Numbers were read. Voices answered in turn. When Anna's number came, her voice carried across the cold morning air with that same steady tone. The count finished quickly, and the formation dissolved as the women walked toward the mess hall for breakfast. As she passed the guard station, Anna glanced toward Daniel and gave a small nod of greeting, the same simple gesture she had offered the day before. Daniel returned the nod. No words were necessary. Hayes arrived a moment later with the morning clipboard and followed Anna with his eyes as she disappeared into the mess hall doorway. "Looks like another ordinary day," he said. Daniel looked out across the open farmland where the rising sun was beginning to melt the frost from the fields. "Yes," he said calmly. Hayes folded the clipboard beneath his arm and leaned against the wooden post beside the guard station. "Funny thing," he added after a moment. "The place still looks exactly the same." Daniel watched the steam rising from the kitchen vents as breakfast was served inside the mess hall. "Some changes do not show from the outside," he replied. Hayes nodded slowly as if understanding the thought without needing further explanation. The camp moved through its routine again. Trucks started near the supply shed. Work. Assignments were posted on the board. Guards rotated along the fence line while the morning light grew brighter across the compound. Yet the quiet influence of those nights remained with the men who had stood beside that Barrack wall and listened. The songs themselves had been simple melodies. Nothing dramatic. Nothing meant for attention. But the effect had traveled farther than the singer likely ever intended. Daniel Mercer walked along the fence line once more later that morning as the sun climbed over the wide plains of the Midwest. The wind moved gently across the fields beyond the wire while the camp continued its ordinary work behind the fences. Somewhere inside Barrack 7, a woman named Anna Weiss was likely beginning another day like the one before it, helping in the kitchen or the laundry or wherever the roster placed her. She would probably never know exactly how many soldiers had paused outside her barrack to listen to those quiet songs in the night. And perhaps that was the most remarkable part of it all, because the moment had never been about recognition or reward. It had simply been about one person choosing kindness in a place where the world expected only distance. Daniel looked once more toward the row of wooden barracks beneath the clear American sky, and continued along the gravel path with the calm understanding that sometimes the quietest voices carry the farthest. Not because they are loud, but because they remind everyone who hears them that humanity can still exist even in the most unlikely places.